Insurrection, a custom campaign created in 1998 as an official add-on licensed by Blizzard. No, not created by them. In full, at least. We do have some interesting tidbits behind the scenes about how the story was ghost-written or at the very least approved manually, which speaks to a more direct involvement by Blizzard than in the development of, say, Retribution, which really didn't have that much of a story by comparison. And so, Aztec New Media giving us Insurrection back just a few scant months after the release of Brood War as a commercial product as well as a custom campaign. Not really going to drudge up the old arguments about how you have to judge this both as a custom campaign and as a commercial product. It's very safe to say that Insurrection wastes your time much more than Retribution does, and as a commercial product, it was a complete farce, even more so than Retribution. So I would levy even more venom and piss and vinegar at the developers of this campaign by comparison. So of course I want to say that right off the bat, but at the same time, I went into that very in depth when I did the Retribution review, and that was just a week ago. So if you're interested in my thoughts on where this stands as a commercial product, just take everything that I say about Retribution and turn it up a little bit, because this product was way worse. And again, this is a product and not a project, and you've got to just accept that. Accept the fact that this was a giant scam, that people actually paid money to play Insurrection. And you won't be happier for it, but at the very least, you'll be a little bit wiser. You'll understand, hey, something really bad happened here, and indeed it did. With all of this said, what else can we say that's a little bit more interesting about Insurrection that we couldn't say about Retribution, that we didn't talk about when we covered Retribution in the review? That is where we will be digging sinking our teeth into this particular project, however you want to interpret it as. Insurrection definitely wastes your time more. And so the first thing that I can mention is, as far as Retribution is concerned, comparing the two has always been something that a lot of people have done down the years, right? I guess it's a natural thing to compare the two of them on the basis that they are both authorized add-ons. I think Stellar Forces was briefly authorized before Blizzard said, even this is too bad for us, so bye. But as far as I'm aware, these are the only two authorized campaigns that are still considered authorized to this day, right? And even their lore, especially Insurrection, as it was manually approved story-wise, even their lore is actually considered canon. But when you look at all of the other things that are considered canon between the books and the comics and the animes, you're gonna regret looking at that list, I guess, is the best way to put that. So it doesn't say too much, but it's just an interesting piece of trivia. So as Insurrection actually has more of a story than Retribution, I think a lot of people are a little bit more partial to it for some strange reason. I also think that a lot of people thought that because the voice acting was hilarious and tongue-in-cheek, and maybe some people thought that it was great unironically, but I think most people just recognized that it was a shit show, and they thought that the developers were in on the joke, which I'm not 100% convinced of, actually. I think that they may have thought that this was a great, well voice-acted campaign. But either way, people did have some idea that there was a little bit of character here to Insurrection. I don't view it as character. I'm very cynical. I feel like, again, the simplest explanation here is that people are incompetent. And they're not only incompetent at voice acting, as we found out in Insurrection, but they are also incompetent at figuring out whether or not this is incompetence at play. And that's where you get the average pleb who plays the campaign and thinks, wow, this is so funny. They're in on the joke. They're making fun of themselves almost. It's a parody. This is not a comedy campaign. I know it seemed like it. I know deadpan spawning queens just create uniting them right in the middle of a cutscene while you're paused and having to listen to fucking Black Morgan talk. Yeah, I know that seems like a comedy skit, but it was real, and it was played straight. And a lot of things about this campaign were played straight. And given the level of quality that we experienced in the gameplay, I'm not willing to acknowledge the idea and treat it with any degree of intellectual seriousness that the developers were trying to do some weird subversion of expectations, or that they were intelligent enough to realize that, hey, this is kind of fucked, but we're being subversive. We're not making it obvious that this is a comedy campaign. It's almost satirical in a sense. Unfortunately, the modern usage of the word satire is in and of itself the lowest form of comedy most of the time, but satire is not a word you can use to describe Insurrection, so I just wanted to dispel that real quick, because I have seen some people think or at least I would reverse engineer based on their opinions, that they seem to think that this was all done tongue-in-cheek style. And maybe, the voice actors themselves may have felt that way, but everything about the story was played 100% straight pretty much. There wasn't actually any real humor besides, like, there's a little bit of hints at trying to be a bit of, having a little bit of humor with the relationship between Black Morgan and Jack Frost, who the two of them are, even the names in this campaign are kind of comedic in that sense. But again, they're played straight, and the relationships, there was a couple of jokes at the expense of Jack Frost or whatever, like Black Morgan saying, oh, I'll just leave you here. And maybe if it had been voice acted in a more competent way, maybe if the script was just tweaked a little bit in that particular context, could have been a funny moment, could have been a little bit endearing, could have had a little bit of character, but of course it didn't. It fell completely flat, just like everything else in this entire Todd Forsaken campaign. And when I say everything else, like, most of the time I'll, at the very least, at the end of the review, at the end of my rants, or somewhere sprinkled into the rant, I'll be able to say, like, well, I know I said everything is terrible, but actually here's one thing that isn't. I can't really say that about Insurrection. I think that the reason why I brought up comparing Retribution and Insurrection in the first place is because I have a very obvious answer to that question, and it is that Retribution is better in literally every way. But that is something that I do think, honestly. I think that by every metric that you can stratify a campaign, an interactive gameplay product, as, Retribution succeeds where Insurrection failed. Or at the very least, like, Insurrection was met parody-wise. But it was either equal to or greater than the experience at the end of the day, Retribution, that is, compared to Insurrection. So Insurrection was just a shit show from start to finish. Started out with a bunch of micro missions, the first of which was utterly pointless, as far as I'm concerned. Really could have just, the establishing stuff there could have been done in a briefing. The second mission was really long and, obviously had a lot of backtracking. And this sets the tone for what you're going to be experiencing. A campaign that takes a long time to get moving in any direction, let alone the direction you want it to go, where you're, expanding a lot and dealing with AI attacking you. It really never gets there, if we're honest, but at the very least, there were some really large maps. It's just that they were populated with missile turrets on fucking islands, pre-placed brigades up the wazoo, stuff that you just had to deal with in a sloggy manner. And that's exactly what the early missions would lead you to believe, actually. Maybe not that they would have large macro maps, but that all of the maps that you would be experiencing, the way to win would be slogging and sluggishly moving around a giant map with a small band of units or something to that effect. And that is basically what we got, regardless of the quantity of units we had or the size of our army. We always were, walking through a map that was either too big or too small to give a shit about. And the bigger maps, which were, I think, more numerous, sometimes were reused. Even a lot of the smaller maps were also reused. But the main takeaway from that was that we're going to be here slogging through a bunch of pre-placed stuff for a while. And I guess that was kind of irrespective of map size, but the bigger maps obviously stand out more because they're more ingrained in your brain. You spend more time in them just moving missile turrets, trying to find the last of the static defense. And thank God we didn't have to do that in the final Zerg map. I'll put it to you that way. Another parallel between Insurrection and Retribution is actually the fact that the Zerg campaign had the same sort of turnaround, where the other two campaigns were better than the Zerg campaign. I can't say tolerable in the case of Insurrection, but they were tolerable in the case of Retribution, and the Zerg campaign made it almost Insurrection level bad. Whereas the Insurrection Zerg campaign was really bad, like some of the worst shit that I've had to deal with. And that's, of course, in recent memory. I'll fully admit recency bias there. I can't say that generically because, of course, I have played Flame Knives. So take of that or make of that what you will. One of the things that I wanted to close out on when we get to that closing point, which is, I imagine, pretty soon, I don't really have too much to say on this campaign, is just the fact that the gameplay loop was very stale. The AIs were reused almost as much as the maps, if not more, probably. And they pioneered, in a sense, the idea that you're going to have these pre-placed structures that spawn units. We've seen that even to this day in modern productions, which really pains me. And obviously, in that sense, like, they fucked up. They did an oopsie. But I'm really wondering why it felt so schizophrenic, because those were only in some of the early Terran missions, and then I don't think they were ever seen again. Even Retribution actually had at least one mission where enemies were spawned. I guess the defense mission in the Protoss campaign had spawned enemies. It's literally called defense, by the way. I went through and timestamped all the videos and found out, wow, mission names were really bad in this, but they were also bad in Retribution. So not something that I was necessarily had never seen before, we'll say. It was just really, really silly. I guess coming away from Insurrection, trying to look at it a little bit more low resolution, right, zoomed out, try to figure out something that we can do, something we can take away from this campaign to make the experience not an entire waste of time, because the experience was a waste of time in terms of trying to get a good experience, good gameplay, right? So we have to try to derive a little bit of additional meaning from the experience by looking back and seeing what we can learn from it and what we can use. And I try to do that with any campaign, even if it wasn't a total waste of my time. But as most of the productions that I play are total wastes of my time, it's important to note when a project is still a waste of your time despite being mostly macro. And Insurrection obviously had less macro than Retribution and some of the other campaigns that we've played. But I would say I have more macro than, for example, Malfurion's Quest, which is, of course, a Warcraft 3 production, and it was from 2019. So it's a little bit harder to compare the two. But just in general, in terms of what we've played recently, I would say Insurrection was up there with some of the worst stuff. And the reason for that is not because it didn't have full macro maps. The reason was more so, I mean, that obviously contributed to it, but really the macro maps were some of the worst experiences in the campaign, actually. And that is important to note because you have to realize at some point your macro becomes more toxic and more annoying than your micro. I think I actually talked about this in the review for Malfurion's Quest, but either way, the whole point of me complaining about the macro in this particular context is to underscore the fact that just making your maps macro doesn't absolve them of sin, doesn't make it so that they're going to be fun. It has no guarantee, basically. And so the player themselves have no guarantee. And I've said this before, but I understand why micro campaigns like Flame Knives and these insane RPG maps and stuff exist in the first place. Part of it might just be the morbid curiosity or whatever wires get mixed in people's brains where they start to think like, I wonder what could be, if I could play DBZ all sagas in StarCraft, that would be great. Like, I don't know what the fuck is wrong with those people, but I'm sure a large part of it was that they played these macro focused campaigns, especially Insurrection, but even to a lesser extent in Retribution. And they say, well, the AI's got all of these, pre-placed units. Some stuff spawns in, and it gets worse as time goes on. Like you look at Ascension of Duran, you look at Empire Wars, you look at all these other campaigns that I actually have yet to play on the stream, but you'll see eventually if you haven't seen them before. And they have these like AI with 10 upgrades and giant pre-placed armadas and entire like 200 army supplies being spawned in on top of you and stuff. So it's just absolutely absurd. It gets to that level pretty early on, like in I would say the early 2000s especially. People were not modding AI at all. That was considered a dead end, I think, by 2002 or something. And that was only exclusively almost used for melee mods and whatever Vision of the Future anime stuff that Razorclaw X had. And so I understand that people would play those and say, wow, that was terrible. I never want to do that again. And of course, they're going to shy away from those macro campaigns as a result because they're going to assume that they're all the same. And for a long time, they were. But the micro campaigns are also all the same in that sense. Not because like maybe they are drastically different in theme or in setting or in the number of units you're using or the degree of mod work that was done. But it all boils down to the same thing, essentially. And it's just that you're removing interactivity, you're removing settings, you're removing game mechanics, you're removing all of these elements that contribute to making StarCraft the greatest RTS. And of course, that's not going to end well for your product. But, Insurrection developers were doing the same thing when they pre-placed 1 billion sunken colonies and spore colonies and Scourge and whatever else and called it a day. And you're doing the same thing if you ever run Zerg Campaign Insane or whatever else. So at some point, you've got to realize that it's not easy, per se, to decide you're not going to waste or it's not easy to not waste the player's time, but it is easy to decide you're not going to waste the player's time. I've said that before in one of the by design videos, I think. And really that's what I felt like. I kept thinking back to that adage, that sort of, I guess, modus operandi, right? The idea that you're going to sit here and say, I'm not okay with wasting my player's time. And I don't care what I have to do as long as the end result is that I'm not wasting the player's time, or at the very least, I'm learning how not to waste the player's time. And as far as I know, nobody associated with Aztec New Media ever went on to make anything else, at the very least anything else in Brood War. Maybe somebody in the comments is a little bit more familiar with the company can correct that. But it doesn't seem to have been a learning experience for them, as they never went on to make anything else that I'm aware of. And I don't think it can really be that much of an experience for anybody else unless you, for some reason, thought it was a good experience when you first played it, and then you watched me play it, or you came across this review and you maybe had your mind changed in that sense, your opinions altered. But even then, it's like, what was stopping you from having, from opening your eyes and trying to see for the first time? What was stopping you in the first place? Why did you go on for so long, just believing in Amon's lies? Why? So if you can answer that question for me, I'd be very grateful. And otherwise, if you have any other further thoughts on Insurrection, put them down in the comments below. I actually don't have much else to say, like I said. I don't think Insurrection was worthy of any of the attention that it got over the past couple of years. Really, it should have just been a very unremarkable footnote beyond the fact that it did have some custom voice acting and some absurd names and very absurd acting direction. It was woefully unremarkable and underwhelming. And on top of it, it actually became very toxic very quickly with the number of pre-play stuff. I think the last Terra mission and most of the Zerg campaign and a good number of the Protoss missions are indicative enough of that. So say what you will about Insurrection, but don't say it's good, and don't tell me that at the very least. You can have your incorrect opinions, but please keep them to yourself. And that is all I will say. That is what we will close on today. Thank you for joining me. And, I don't know. I wanted to say something more vitriolic, like, fuck you, Aztec New Media, but... oh, shit.